Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learning and Development Podcast, sponsored by Infopro Learning. As always, I'm your host, Nolan Hout. Today we have Brian Washburn joining us to talk all things learning and engagement. And there's nobody better to talk about it than Brian. He's the author of multiple books, including his most recent one titled Instructional Design on a Shoestring. Fitting, because we will not be avoiding the topic of budget and lack thereof in our podcast today. Speaking of our podcast, let's get it kicked off. Hello, Brian. Welcome to the podcast.
Nolan, it's great to be here. I'm excited.
Thanks. So, Brian, before we get into the topic today, which I know is really interesting, we're going to talk about how to make learning stick. We first like to start with every podcast with just learning a little bit more about our guests. You know, it's uncommon, I would say, in learning and development that somebody has spent their whole career, you know, they went to college for it and they started with it. Everybody comes from kind of sometimes untraditional backgrounds that got into it. So if you would, Brian, what is your origin story to where you are today, where you run a L&D and a consulting practice?
Yeah, it's a fun question that I was just talking about this weekend with somebody. But I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay like 27 years ago.
Okay.
My best friend and I decided we wanted to come back to the Peace Corps office someday. She would be the country director. I would be the number 2 person in the country office, which is the program and training officer. And so I asked her, you know, what do you think would position me for this role? And she said, instructional design, look into instructional design. And so that was where the seed was planted. And then it was buried and I had forgotten about it for a while. I came back, I taught GED classes. So I worked in a classroom for a while.
Yeah.
And then I decided, you know, the classroom, it's not where I want to be.
Okay.
And that's where the idea of instructional design came back. I was looking at master's programs, found some programs on adult learning when I was looking for adult basic education, which was more of a GED focus. And in adult learning, I started kind of going down that rabbit hole. Took a job as a training kind of coordinator, worked my way up to training director for several different nonprofits and NGOs, and all along the way, ATD was a big part of that experience. Trying to kind of figure out who are the thought leaders, what books should I be reading. So ATD had great resources about that stuff. And so through a confluence of just kind of self-study, this dream of being the program and training officer, and then falling into these roles and training was kind of what the super potion was. That was my origin story.
What is it that you think, like, why did you want to pursue that path in the first place? What is it about learning, training, instructional design that you think scratches the itch for you?
You know, my father was a teacher. He was for his entire career, and I tried to avoid it. And then when I came back from one of the things I really liked about my Peace Corps experience was using flip chart and going out into the fields and working with farmers and teaching them what a co-op was and things like that. And then when I came back, I was like, I can't just kind of set up in a farm with flip chart and markers, right? So I took what seemed to be the closest thing, teaching GED classes, and I loved it, right? Working with students and finding that aha moment. And finding creative ways, right? So these are students for whom the traditional education system didn't work. And so what could capture their attention? What could keep them engaged and wanting to come back each day? Because they didn't have to be there. And so being able to find creative ways to help people learn was kind of what started to build into this DNA.
That's interesting. And so, you know, you mentioned creative ways, and a lot of what we want to talk about today is how do we make learning stick beyond those traditional methods, and something, you know, that you write in your book is this, what's your formula? And that's part of the title. What really drew you to that? Because I'm guessing, you know, untraditional means it's not always a science, but a formula is scientific. So how did you choose that metaphor, and how does it relate to kind of creating those experiences?
I have always been a fan of the idea of drawing inspiration from anywhere. And so it was a random day off of school for my oldest child. I don't even remember why. It was like between semesters or quarters or something. And so we went out to lunch at a place called the Lunchbox Laboratory, and we're eating, and I was looking at their placemat, and there's a periodic table of things, and it was like food elements. It was like ketchup and you know, Kobe beef and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, that's kind of creative. And then I started thinking, I wonder what that would look like for learning elements. And so my mind just started racing, and I took a hike later that afternoon and was thinking, what would be some elements and I started texting some colleagues, and I was like, "What?" I was like a dog with a bone. I wanted to do something with this, and I think that eventually it turned into this periodic table, this periodic table, right?
Okay.
And so there's 51 different elements across 5 different categories, and it was so fun to put together. I love the idea of a metaphor. When we talk about sticky learning, I think that a metaphor really helps people connect with new concepts. So, this idea of introducing something that's familiar, periodic table, we all went through science class, with some new concepts. Well, these are not the chemical elements, these are the things that make learning go. And when we can combine these things, because doing these things in isolation doesn't really work. So, when we can bond these different elements together, that's when we can start to create a formula for really, really amazing learning experiences. And so it was kind of a fun metaphor to put together, but also it wasn't just kind of randomly throwing a bunch of elements out there. We started to organize them by kind of their function.
Right.
There's kind of 5 different categories of different elements out there, similar to the periodic table, right? There's solids and gases and liquids
Noble
and metals
gases.
and things like that.
Yeah, and what I like about that is that, it seems like when we're creating these learning assets, sometimes we almost do get put into this box of like, well, what is it going to be? Instructor led or asynchronous, or is it going to have a video? And not only do we put ourselves in the box when we start the program, but I feel like sometimes we get asked to be put into that box from a skill set, from like an instructional design standpoint. And it kind of gets us into this position where we just feel like we don't have a lot of options. But you're right. I mean, I think if you really just laid it all out and said, this is everything this is our toolbox. These are the elements that make up great instructional design. Let's use a little bit of everything here and let's make sure we're picking from the right things. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I imagine, especially, with some of your Peace Corps work, you're used to working with what you have. And gosh, what a great call to action today. I mean, we've known in our space, doing more with less. I think we could probably call that the mantra of learning and development, right? I think if there was one tagline, we could probably say that's what it is. And so I'm assuming you've probably been in this either through your GED education on that end, Peace Corps, kind of what you're doing now. So how does that come into play? Is that like a big element of why you wanted to present these options, is to say, listen, if you have a budget, is that another way to do it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because we were talking with a potential client a few weeks ago. And as we started to hear some of their thoughts, we asked, okay, so we have some thoughts, we have some ideas. Do you have a budget that you're thinking about for this project? And they were a little bit coy. They said, well, we have budget. We're not Coca-Cola. And then I had to laugh, because even people who work for Coca-Cola or Amazon or Microsoft or Boeing or whatever Starbucks, whatever large company you can think of, the training, while those companies may be well-funded and profitable, the training component of those organizations never has the resources that they wish that they could have, right?
We have one of our largest clients is one of the largest oil organizations in the entire world, right? Worth trillion. They probably make millions a second. And it was so funny because I remember a person came to me and said, hey, can we discount this program? And I'm like, well, how much does it cost? They're like, it's cost $1,000. And I'm like, they're asking for a discount on $1,000 program, and this is a company that makes probably $1 million a second. So you're right; it's 100% true.
Yeah, and that's so. And when it comes to that, so as learning professionals, we have to figure out, okay, well, so how do we work within our means?
Right. Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that there are some really creative ways that there are ways to make really expensive learning. And I've worked with people in the medical profession who use AI and VR. I'm sorry, VR.
AR, VR. Yeah.
They use VR in order to train surgeons on how to do cataract surgery. So before they work on a patient, right, they have the VR goggles on and they're going through all the motions with their hands to make sure they can do it, or pilots, right? But very few of us are in that specific type of field. And so what is it that we can do that is going to kind of fit within the budget? And my background, teaching GED classes, but I was also the training director for a nonprofit that worked in foster care. I was the training director for an NGO that worked in eliminating corneal blindness. We never had a lot of money. And so the question is, how do we kind of take a look at our resources and make something that's effective? And so when you take a look at this periodic table of elements. There's lots of different ideas. I think that a lot of people in their gut, they know what good training is, but
Mm-hmm.
a really good way to waste money is not to have is to not be very strategic or very educated in terms of what it is that we want to put together in our program. So when we can put labels and names on practices, then we can repeat those over and over and over again. And we're no longer trying to throw things against the wall to see what sticks. We're actually able to create something that's effective. And so that goes back to this idea of the metaphor of the periodic table, as well as just, creating something that is sticky within, a budget that we have to work with.
Yeah, so like, what are some of those? So I'll share one while I give you time to think of a good example and the question is, what is a good example of a great way to have high impact on a low budget? One of my favorite ones, the lady who leads our commercial practice, our internal sales training practice, we have a whole division that just does sales training. She always touts, one of the highest ROI program I've ever ran was a series of emails that we sent to sales managers. And the email went to the sales manager and it simply said, here is an email that I want you to send to your sales team. And that email was very simple. It just said, hey, go ask your clients, how are you liking the product that you bought last year and what are your plans for this year? And so the sales manager dutifully opens it up, okay, sends it along. Out of that, a client calls and says, hey, thank you. We've loved it. We want to buy 2 more. And these are $1 million machines. They're not and so that one email generated $2 million of business. So it's not so that's one of my favorite examples because how much does it cost to make an email? You don't anybody can do that. So what's maybe one of your, Hall of Fame, low budget, high impact examples?
Yeah, well, I love that example because one of the biggest things that companies make a mistake on when it comes to thinking about learning is thinking that it has to be, whether it's instructor led, asynchronous, e-learning, formal, right? It has to be formal.
Yeah.
And the other mistake they make is we're developing our people. Our people are smart people. So we're sending them to training and we're going to depend on them to implement things. And the research shows that it's the manager. That manager is the cornerstone, is the linchpin to figuring out how will something actually be applied on the job. And so that particular example that you just shared goes with everything that we know about how learning actually works, right? So it's a series of emails. It's low lift for the manager, right? We're not putting a burden on the manager to say, hey, come up with some questions.
Mm-hmm.
We're giving them the questions to ask. And we didn't even have to pull people offline to go through a training.
Yeah.
So one of the things that, an example that I have and I like to share is that we had one client call us up and say, it was at the start of the pandemic, can you work with our staff on just, can you put together a training program, or how much would a training program cost to work with our staff on facilitating virtually? And I said, we could. Let me ask you a few more questions. And when I started asking questions, it turned out that what their biggest need wasn't to get people trained on how to deliver something virtually. It was figuring out what do people actually need to learn, because everyone across the organization had a different role and needed to learn something different. And so if you're going to pull everyone together for a virtual session that only one person is going to benefit from, then that's not a good investment at all. So what we ended up doing was we flipped it and said, before we do any sort of virtual training presentations or education on how to deliver virtually, maybe what we need to do is just invest a little bit of money in creating a competency model or a success profile to figure out what do people need. Because it was when we started to talk to people there, it was a bunch of different answers. Everybody needed something different. And so it was clear to us that there was no one training that was going to be their magic bullet. But also, people didn't really know what they needed to do in order to get ahead. So when we were able to lay out a roadmap of this is what we need to do in order to get ahead, then they could actually start to work with people. And instead of creating a training program on virtual delivery, what we did was we trained managers on how to mentor some of their people, some of the more junior staff, in order to skill up. So it wasn't a training program at all. It was a kind of a mentorship type of thing.
Yeah. So how do you kind of strike that balance between formal and informal, especially nowadays with so much focus being on skill development, right, versus kind of job development? when it's job development, there's a lot of, oh, well, they'll just learn it on the job. Well, they're just kind of pick it up. But now there's a much, that shift to, well, they need to be a better communicator. And yeah, maybe you pick up some of that on the job, but you need some, like, you meant, when you think about it, is you kind of need a mentor there. And a lot of people, unfortunately, when you tell them that, yeah, I'm going to train you on this skill, they don't really want to learn it. They're like, well, I already know I know this, I know how to communicate, versus, if you tell me how to make a widget and I don't know how to make a widget, I'm definitely going to listen. How are we able to make an impact on these skills when, via informal means, I guess is the question.
Yeah, when you think of an organization, and I think that informal learning is one of the great untapped powers or potentials that organizations have, and they don't oftentimes release that potential because they don't think about it.
Yeah.
Some organizations, and you have different organizations at different levels of maturity when it comes to their learning programs. So in an ideal world, there is the Center for Creative Leadership, kind of 70-20.
Yeah.
Kind of the thought process there is about 10% of our new learning comes through formal means, about 20% comes through supportive relationships, and 70% is kind of those stretch assignments or that on the job kind of learning or things like that. And so an organization, like an ideal organization that is mature in its learning programs, will have a combination of all of that stuff. And they'll have, a mentor program where people are trained in terms of what that means to be a mentor and to work with people and to develop people that way. They'll have the formal learning programs, whether it's instructor-led or an LMS that has clear learning paths for people to take. And then there's the on-the-job kind of growth type of thing too. But to your question, in terms of how do we actually maximize the potential for informal learning, the first thing I think is to make sure that we kind of remove a stigma from it, right? So organizations can and should. A lot of organizations have some sort of intranet, whether it is a Slack channel or a Teams channel, kind of using some of the bigger intranet kind of services that are out there. But that is a perfect, and a lot of organizations have them, and people just kind of stuff things there, and it's like, how do we use this? It's bloated and overwhelming. But if we can kind of clean things up so that people are aware of how they can access, like, on the kind of just in time videos, right? So for me, for example, if I need to fix the garbage disposal because it is not working in my house, I don't go to Home Depot and take an all-day training session, general home maintenance. I will pull up a 2-minute YouTube video and figure out, will this kind of solve my problem? And usually it does. Why can't we do that at work as well? Why don't we have resources, whether they're just kind of general resources that we can go to YouTube or things that are on the internet, in order to help us do our job better when we need to know that information?
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a shift there. One of my favorite questions when I'm speaking and engaging with chief learning officers and CHROs is, when you analyze your training budget, I mostly just start with, would you subscribe to roughly 70-20-10, is roughly how people learn? And most people say, yeah, it's roughly that. And I say, how much do you spend on the 10% versus the 70% versus the 20%? And it's usually the exact opposite, right? I've spent 70% on formal. I don't spend any money on making my managers better. I don't really see that, like, L&D does not see that hitting them. But I wonder, one of the things you touched on, and it's something that we at Infopro I'm working with our head of leadership on. We just launched a product called Guru Leadership, and it is a AI agent that essentially becomes your coach. And we're testing it with some clients right now, because what we're trying to identify is, during COVID, everybody went out and bought these large, LinkedIn Learning, whatever it is, right? And, as you would expect, nobody took any of that training because whatever, I don't want to badmouth anything, but they didn't take it.
Right. People get busy, right? There's other things. And unless we're directed to take that,
yeah.
I know people who are like, I love LinkedIn Learning, and they are self-directed, and
exactly.
That's not the majority of
no. And so, but what the majority of and I fit into that majority. And I said, really, what I would like is, if I have to give a tough conversation, I want to be able to ask like I would ask YouTube how to fix a disposal, how to fix my team, how to fix the communication issues on my team. I don't think to do that like yet. I mean, but I think the generation below me probably would be more than I mean, you have the whole zeitgeist is shifting. We have all those, I mean, it's probably billions of a dollar industry with online therapy. I forget, BetterHelp and all these companies that are doing online therapy. So we're starting to get used to the acceptableness of I just need this answer and I need it kind of, I need it now. But I think the issue has always been content, right? Like YouTube is pulling from 7 billion people in the world who have all had the same disposal issue. Somebody was smart enough to make the video on how to solve it. But how do we do that internally? And what we're finding is AI is really unlocking that and democratizing the subject matter expertise that used to live within an organization. How are you seeing organizations leverage AI or other tools, whatever it should be, to deliver more of that real time, on the job, kind of YouTube type? I ask a question, I get an answer type training.
Yeah, now things like ChatGPT and Gemini, those are tools that we're seeing people use a lot. Now there are a few exceptions with that. I've been working with several organizations in the financial industry and financial services, and like we can't use AI. We're not allowed to. And so they continue to work through a little bit more traditional means, but they'll bring in somebody like us to do a train the trainer program, and as opposed to being able to, which I think that there's lots of value of having, still bringing in the experts to talk about different things and to train people on different things. AI has tons of advantages in terms of saving time. It also has some things that you need to be careful about in terms of the veracity of the information. Is it going to be accurate? Is it the right stuff that's there? And also, what is the tool that we're using, and where does the information go that we're putting in there? So we want to there's lots of questions around proprietary information, and don't put that stuff into AI and things like that. That said, a lot of the organizations, even the nonprofit organizations that we're working with that don't have a ton of funding, have really kind of embraced things like ChatGPT or Gemini in order to help, just as a starting point. Whether it is to create case studies, whether that is to help with slide design. I've even seen people use it to kind of improve their resume and get questions for.
Yeah, that's a great application.
Not just get questions that could be asked based on a job description, but what are the answers for the question, right? So there's so many things that it can, and I love how you're talking about a tool that has a specific coaching focus. And I've talked with some other kind of business owners who are dabbling in the world of AI for this specific reason, because the idea of, we don't always have a mentor. We don't always have somebody who will have the answers or has the experience. So being able to rely on or leverage technology and the technology that's available to us today in order to ask questions and get some answers, to get some guidance, are all things that we're seeing people using out there.
Yeah, and I think we're probably, I think we're not, I don't know if we're quite there. It's interesting because so much of it is a culture standpoint as well. Like you mentioned, from how do people view technology? How do they view their answers, right? If I'm asking a very sensitive coaching question, who gets that? And what happens with that? I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of unpacking that we have to do, when it comes to that. So, now that we've covered AI, I feel like we've officially checked every box that you have to in a podcast. I don't think you're allowed to finish a podcast, right, without, mentioning AI. But for those, so we've talked about AI, we've talked about some low budget things. What are a couple takeaways maybe that you could give to some people that right now are in this transition? Because I definitely feel that we're in this transition of, we were not really digital, and then we were forced to go digital, but it was a square peg in a round hole. You just had to go, even if digital wasn't the best fit, that's what you did. Now I think we're a little bit more intentional. So what are some things that you can maybe, AI, whatever, tools to say, okay, we're all in this together. What are those big commonalities that you're seeing across the board that really is making the biggest impact for learners?
So, there's one of the areas that I've seen some of the biggest impact come from is simply conversations that people are having in social media, and specifically LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And so are some phenomenal people that people should be following when it comes to LinkedIn and some of the conversations that are having there. And it's certainly that has helped to shape me and some of the ways that I go about doing things. So and it's just a great place where information continues to be shared. So people like Will Thalheimer will share information about research and truly best practices and trying to get away from some of the things that we've done because we've always done them, even though
Yeah.
they're not really instructionally sound things. And people like Mel Milloway is always out there and has been building out courses or products based on using AI tools. So there's a lot of, it's really interesting if you're following the right people to see people work out loud and to see what people are sharing out there. So those are just kind of a few of just the social learning aspects that if people are looking to up their game when it comes to learning and development, those are always there. Now, we've also going from we've talked about AI, we've talked a little bit about social media, but going to some of the traditional things that people are using. PowerPoint is something that people have been using for decades and will continue to use. It is something that will not die. Like it is expected when you go into a session that there are going to be
Yeah.
slides.
Yep.
And so we've been talking with people and working with people just in terms of what does that mean? And is your PowerPoint slide deck synonymous with presentation? So some simple things like that when it comes to technology, because the answer is no, right? So a deck is not the same as a presentation. I have a booklet out that I worked on with ATD years ago called PowerPoint, Your Co-Facilitator. So when we think of technology and we think of using technology in a training setting, we need to think of ourselves as the rock star. PowerPoint or whatever else other tools
Right.
we're using are kind of the backup singers. Nobody comes to a concert to see the backup singers. They come for the main act, and the backup singers offer some valuable ways to enhance that session. So we've been kind of finding that working on different levels, the AI stuff, the social media stuff, as well as the fundamental technologies that people are using are all really three important focuses.
Yeah, I think there's so much to the human element of it all. Like you mentioned, conversations. We've always struggled in learning with engagement. As a marketer myself, I understand that pain because it's one of the hardest things to do, right? If you're a marketer and you're listening to this and you got to sell Coca-Cola, well, that's the number one brand in the world. Everybody loves to drink you, cry me a river. Try marketing something to either a 60-year-old white guy, a 18-year-old college intern from Alabama, somebody who speaks English as a fifth language, somebody who's retired, somebody who's 16, somebody who's 30, a salesperson, a CFO, an ops person, somebody who doesn't use a laptop except to take training. Try to create something that engages all of them, and there's no reward for them that they're immediately going to get. It is the ultimate struggle, and what I tell people is, listen, sometimes it's actually just about guerrilla marketing one-on-one. I say a lot of times if you're struggling to fill a classroom, message them on Teams or Slack. Just say, hey, I was speaking to your manager, John. He had, said that you might want to take this training program. I just wanted to make sure you knew about it. Here it is, right? Because we're all inundated with 1,000 emails and 1,000 thises and 1,000 that's. Sometimes it doesn't hurt to just remember, like, maybe I should just ask a person, let me make this a little bit more personal one-on-one. So don't let everything has to be built for scale and built for widespread release. Sometimes you just gotta pick up the phone.
Yeah, and the relationships, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things that is not emphasized enough, I think, in the world of in any industry probably, but certainly learning and development, is the relationships matter. Whether that is relationships with people's supervisors, relationships with potential learners, relationships with department heads, relationships with the stakeholders that will have the power of the purse. When I was working in my previous job, I worked for an eye bank, so cornea transplants.
Okay.
Super smart people, some of the smartest people in the world doing this work. And I was one of the only people that ever came into that organization without a technical background. And so they were, I think when I first arrived, there was some amusement of, this guy, that's cool that he does this training stuff, but we know what we're doing. And so when I was trying to get people to improve the instructionally sound nature of their learning programs, I wasn't getting a lot of traction until I worked with one person who worked in the operations team.
Mm,
And when she kind of got to see some of the stuff that I had to offer, she's like, "Wow, this is really great." And it wasn't me that went to the rest of the organization and said, "You need to work with Brian." It was her. She became a
mhm.
champion for really good learning practices, and that was something that, or you should attend Brian's session on instructional design because it can really help. It makes things more interesting when either when we're presenting at a conference or when we're presenting to our team, even in a team meeting. It could be really helpful. And it wasn't me shouting, "Hey," from learning perspective, "Hey, look, come
Yeah.
learn how to do this better." It was a champion in the organization that was of the operations team who was able to say that. So, like you're mentioning, that kind of guerrilla marketing, the one-on-one, the relationships, and finding people, other people who can champion the work that we're doing, even though they don't have training in their title, can be so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, as we leave, Brian, one last piece of advice I'd ask you to give to our audience here. You've gone on and have a very successful career, and you actually educate and advise and consult with organizations who do this. For those people who are maybe just getting into this field, or maybe they've just kind of hit a roadblock, what's the one thing, what's the low-hanging fruit you think that people can work on that they might be able to implement today to see results tomorrow?
Yeah, so it's a low hanging fruit that we oftentimes don't see, and it has kind of three pieces to it. One is that we need to be thinking about the organization itself, right? So when I first started in learning, I was like, "Oh, I love creativity," right? We talked about this at the very beginning. I love creative approaches, ways to engage people. I was actually the mascot for my university. I loved doing things that were creative. And so when I first started putting together training programs, people were like, "That was so great." And people would see me a year later and they're like, "I took your session a year ago. It was so awesome." And I would be like, "So what have you done with it since?" And they're like, "Not really anything, but it was really a great session," right? And so if we want to kind of further our craft, we need to think beyond engagement and think about what's effective. And there's three things that make a training program effective. And if we're thinking about these, we can, and if we're working on a training project right now, tomorrow it will be a better project. So think about, first of all, the organization and what's the organization's need. The second thing is thinking about the manager. We've already talked about this, the email that a manager sent, but the manager really will determine whether or not somebody is held accountable and will use something afterwards. So how do we get the manager involved? And what tools can we put into a busy manager's hand without actually making them do a lot more work? "Hey, manager, you need to support the training." No, that's not how to do it. So how can we support managers? And then finally, it's really us. It's the trainers that we really need to create a lesson that will suit, either if we're delivering the training that will suit us, or if we're creating training for somebody else to deliver, we can't create it for us. We need to create
Yeah.
it for that other person's voice in order to be able to deliver the training. So think about the organization and its need. Think about how managers are going to get involved without actually doing much work. We need to do the work for them, and then who's delivering this. And I think that those three things, if you're taking those into account, will make an impact as soon as possible.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a big believer in the if you can't answer the question what's in it for the learner, and you don't look at every problem through the eyes. I always look at the company standpoint first, right? Like what does this company care about? What does the learner care about? I rarely include the manager, but that you're right. They are the person driving that forward. What a great well, Brian, thank you so much for the time today. Thanks for spending some time and sharing your knowledge with us. This has been great.
I love this opportunity. Thank you so much, Nolan. I'll come back anytime. I love this conversation.
Great. Thank you.